The skies over Iran are a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered concrete, a testament to the overwhelming, devastating power of the American and Israeli war machine. For weeks, a relentless air campaign has pounded the Islamic Republic. From the cockpit of an F-35, the war looks like a resounding success. America and Israel have achieved what military planners dream of: complete and total aerial supremacy. The majority of Iran's aging air defenses are now silent, their radar dishes mangled, their missile batteries vaporized. The launch sites that once threatened the region are now little more than craters in the desert. Swaths of Iran's most senior leadership, men who have guided the regime for decades, have been systematically eliminated in precise, targeted strikes. The vast majority of the tonnage in Iran's surface fleet now rests at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, a ghost fleet haunting the seabed. All of this has led to President Trump repeatedly and confidently claiming victory in this war. On television from the White House lawn, he speaks of a mission accomplished, a rogue regime brought to its knees. But this is a lie. This is a catastrophic illusion. Because while America is winning a spectacular war in the air, it is losing a devastating, far more important war on the water. The biggest problem in the world right now is a crisis of Donald Trump's, America's, and Israel's own making, and it is proving devilishly, perhaps impossibly, difficult to solve. They have failed to counter Iran's greatest weapon, a weapon that isn't a missile or a warship, but a simple fact of geography: its ability to shut down the critical Strait of Hormuz, the jugular vein through which 1/5 of the entire global supply of oil and liquefied natural gas must travel. There are, in essence, two entirely different wars currently being waged, and both are equally lopsided. The first is America and Israel's aerial war against the Islamic Republic, a war of technological dominance that they are winning by every conceivable metric. The second, however, is Iran's separate asymmetric war against the global economy, a war the Americans and Israelis are, day by agonizing day, busy losing. From the very beginning, the Iranian regime knew with absolute certainty that they could never win a conventional war against the dramatically, almost alienly, technologically superior Americans and Israelis. They knew that their air force would be swept from the skies in hours. They knew their navy was a floating coffin. They knew they would have no easy method of evicting American and Israeli warplanes from their airspace. But they also knew something that the Trump administration apparently did not: that the Americans would have no easy method of eliminating their ability to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. And by extension, no easy method of removing Iran's capability to hold a knife to the throat of the global economy, creating an unbearable pressure point to end both of these wars on their own terms. The Trump administration evidently catastrophically miscalculated Iran's willingness and ability to actually pull this trigger, and they tragically misjudged just how hard it would be to stop Iran once they did. And as a result, America is now trapped in what is rapidly metastasizing into the biggest foreign policy mistake since the Iraq War in 2003. The war against Iran now seriously risks becoming America's version of Ukraine, a bloody, expensive, and unwinnable quagmire. The Strait of Hormuz is the principal reason why every US president before Trump, stretching all the way back to the Carter administration, hesitated to ever actually attack Iranian territory directly. Because despite enormous American superiority in conventional firepower, Iran has always held the cards when it comes to geography. These are cards that cannot be countered by stealth bombers and aircraft carriers alone. Iran doesn't need to physically block the Strait of Hormuz in a literal sense. It doesn't even need a navy to enforce a closure of it. All it needs to do is create an atmosphere of chaos. All it needs is to attack merchant ships sailing through it every now and then with cheap, plentiful missiles, drones, and mines. It needs to create an environment of profound uncertainty, of unacceptable risk, of sheer terror, that leads to merchant vessels simply refusing to travel through it altogether, or, just as effectively, insurance companies like Lloyd's of London simply refusing to insure them. At its narrowest point, the strait is a mere 54 kilometers wide, flanked on both of its sides by rough, mountainous terrain that provides perfect cover for mobile missile and drone launchers. The designated sea lanes that flow through the center of the strait, the deep channels that massive tanker ships must transit, are so narrow that there's only space for two of them, one running in each direction. They are predictable, slow-moving, and easy targets for mines, for anti-ship missiles, and for swarms of kamikaze drones. Moreover, the seas on either side of the strait for hundreds of kilometers are well within range of Iranian drones like the Shahid 136, which has an operating range of about 1,500 kilometers. The Iranians were estimated to have a supply of around 50,000 of these drones before this war began. sinking all of Iran's navy, destroying most of its fixed missile launchers, and killing most of its senior leadership. All of these tactical victories do absolutely nothing to prevent Iran from being able to weaponize its geography and keep the strait de facto closed. This is a fact that every single presidential administration for the last 40 years has been keenly, intimately aware of. And every single day the strait remains closed, the pressure builds. It builds on the global economy, and it builds on the Americans to end the war on Iran's terms. Every single day that the strait remains closed, 1/5 of the global supply of oil and gas originating from Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, and the UAE is effectively choked off from the global market. There are a few exceptions, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE's pipelines that can divert a fraction of their own supplies overland, but that is a luxury that simply doesn't exist for Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, or Qatar. Their entire economic lifeline to the world has been severed. The International Energy Agency has already labeled this situation as the largest oil supply shock ever recorded in human history. This has already led to oil prices skyrocketing by more than 40% since the war began, and natural gas prices in Europe, which is heavily reliant on Qatari LNG, have soared by a staggering 70%. As the price of oil and gas climbs, so does the cost of doing business for every company on Earth. The cost of fuel, the cost of power, the cost of manufacturing, the cost of shipping, it all rises. Companies inevitably pass those increased costs onto their consumers, and the result is crippling inflation. The general guideline that many economists subscribe to is that every $10 increase in the price of a barrel of oil eventually results in a rise of 0.3 to 0.4 percentage points to overall inflation. Before the war, oil was hovering at a stable $60 a barrel. It has already blasted past $100 a barrel since the Hormuz closure. This means the inflation rate in America and Europe might eventually climb back over 4% again, a level last seen back in the dark days of 2023 during the Biden administration. And if the price of oil continues its terrifying ascent, assuming the loss of supply through Hormuz remains in place, inflation rates climbing back to 5% and even 6% are not just possible, but likely. If oil hits $140 a barrel, this will be politically lethal for Trump and the Republican Party, who ran in 2024 on a solemn promise to lower prices and keep the country out of foolish foreign wars. A recent grim study published by Oxford Economics suggests that if the price of oil manages to climb to $140 a barrel, a very real possibility if the closure remains in place through the end of April, the global economy may well tip over into a painful mild recession, and the damage is already done. Even if the strait were to magically open up tomorrow, the negative consequences rippling through the global economy will last for months, perhaps years. It would take weeks for the Gulf states to restart their mothballed oil and gas production facilities. Qatar's supermassive Ras Laffan LNG production site, a jewel of global energy infrastructure, which alone produces nearly 1/5 of the entire global supply of LNG, will take between 3 and 5 years to fully repair and get back to full production, according to the country's energy ministry. This comes after a single Iranian missile blew up about 17% of its total capacity, an act of economic terrorism that instantly erased about 3% of the total global LNG supply. Once production is eventually restarted, it'll then take several more weeks for the world's tanker fleet to actually reposition itself back into the Gulf. Most of the ships that were fortunate enough to be outside the Gulf when the war began have already moved on to other safer markets, like the route between North America and China. Then, once the crude oil is finally transported by these tankers to refineries, largely across Asia, which have themselves been shut down due to lack of supply, it'll take weeks more to get those complex facilities back up and running again. All in all, even after the shooting stops around Hormuz, it'll likely take at least 4 more months for the global oil and gas market to return to any semblance of normalcy. And the longer the strait remains closed, the further out into the future that return to normalcy is pushed, and the greater the specter of global inflation and a deep recession becomes. Iran, ironically, has the easier path to victory in this war. All that it must do to win is endure, survive, absorb the punishment from the air, and wait just long enough for the economic pressure it is inflicting through Hormuz to become unbearable for the West. America and Israel, on the other hand, face a monumental task. They have to either topple its government entirely, destroy its military capabilities to such an extent that it can no longer threaten Hormuz, or, in a move of last resort, put boots on the ground to physically secure Hormuz in a bloody ground campaign. After massive American and Israeli airstrikes have pummeled the country for more than a month, the Islamic Republic's regime not only remains intact, but if anything, it has grown even more hardline, more defiant than it was before. Before the war began, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, was nearing 87 years old and was known to be in ill health. It was considered possible that after his looming and natural death, the regime might have shifted toward a more pragmatic posture, aimed at improving their dire economic conditions and ensuring their own long-term survival. But now, by killing the supreme leader violently in a missile strike and forcing a leadership transition under the immense pressure of war, the regime quickly coalesced behind the old supreme leader's son, Mojtaba Khomeini. By all accounts, Mojtaba is an even more hardline figure than his father was, a man with deep, intimate ties to the country's IRGC, its ideological military wing. With American and Israeli forces having now killed his father, his mother, his wife, and his son, and with reports that he himself was personally injured in an airstrike, he will not be in any mood to negotiate while he still draws breath. The Americans and Israelis apparently went into this war believing a lie they told themselves that they could rapidly decapitate and overthrow the Iranian regime through overwhelming air power alone, before Tehran could actually manage to block Hormuz. It is a miscalculation of historic proportions, increasingly echoing Russia's delusional belief in 2022 that they could similarly overthrow the Ukrainian government in only 3 days. And just like the war in Ukraine, the war in Iran is rapidly devolving into a brutal war of attrition, a contest of which side can outlast the other. It is painfully obvious at this point that air power alone will not compel the Iranian regime to collapse, nor will it ever fully degrade Iran's capability to keep Hormuz closed. Bombs cannot alter geography. And while the war is resulting in the significant destruction of Iran's military capabilities, it is also sapping America's military strength from other more critical theaters. America does not possess an unlimited arsenal of high-tech weaponry. According to a recent analysis by the Payne Institute of Public Policy, the U.S. military burned through more than 11,000 munitions of different types in just the first 16 days of the war on Iran. That is more than in any other Western military campaign since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Among these have been more than 850 Tomahawk cruise missiles, each one costing nearly $4 million. That's over $3 billion just in Tomahawks, incinerated in a matter of weeks, potentially representing about a quarter of America's entire pre-war stockpile. Even worse, the Defense Department had originally budgeted to acquire just 57 new Tomahawks for the entire year of 2026. More than 140 Patriot interceptor missiles and 150 THAAD interceptor missiles were also fired by U.S. forces, from inventories that were already known to be running dangerously low. The Defense Department hasn't received any additional THAAD interceptors in years, and was only expecting to get another 39 of them next year. They already used up about a quarter of their existing THAAD stockpiles in 2025, just protecting Israel during the 12-day war in June. Replacing all of these expended munitions will take years and tens of billions of dollars. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy is increasingly running on literal fumes. The Gerald R. Ford aircraft carrier, the tip of the spear in this campaign, has been continuously at sea on deployment, now for more than 280 days. It was previously deployed to Venezuela for the Maduro operation, and was then almost immediately redeployed to the Middle East without a break. By the middle of this month, it will surpass the record for the longest continuous carrier deployment since the Vietnam War. The stress on the ship and its crew is becoming unbearable. In March, a fire broke out on the carrier that burned the beds for more than 600 sailors. Crew fatigue is reaching critical levels. The Defense Department has already requested an additional $200 billion from Congress to continue fighting this war and to replenish its depleted munition stockpiles. But there is no guarantee that a divided and debt-weary Congress will approve such a mammoth request. Continuing the air war in Iran is only going to continue burning up increasingly precious assets that many in the top U.S. military brass would rather husband away for a potential far more serious conflict with China in the Western Pacific. There will be fewer and fewer important targets left to hit, and these strikes will do nothing to help the U.S. win the separate, more important war that Iran is waging on the global economy. They will not remove the Iranian regime, and they will not eliminate Iran's geographic ability to keep shutting down the Strait of Hormuz. Iran knows all of this, and that's why they'll continue demanding favorable terms to end the war, so long as they can keep that strait shut. All of this leaves President Trump and America in a truly terrible position. He basically has only three equally unpalatable, politically disastrous options. First, he can negotiate while Iran holds the leverage of the Strait of Hormuz. This means Iran will demand favorable terms that will make the entire war look like a humiliating defeat for America. Second, he can do nothing. He can continue the air war, pretend it's working, and watch the global economy continue to worsen, a disaster for which he will be blamed. Even declaring the war over while Iran still blocks the strait will make it appear like he's doing nothing as the world slides into recession. Or third, he can double down on this catastrophic gamble and attempt to remove Iran's leverage by forcing open the Strait of Hormuz through an escalatory bloody ground campaign. This frighteningly seems increasingly likely as the option that's actually going to happen. Launching a full-scale ground invasion into Iran is an unbelievably unattractive option. The country is a natural fortress, shielded by towering mountain ranges like the Zagros and the Alborz, and the high plateau running between them that have defended Iran from foreign invaders for thousands of years. Take the precedent of America's last full-scale invasion, the 2003 invasion of neighboring Iraq. That campaign involved about 300,000 US soldiers for the initial ground invasion and then required a peak of about 160,000 soldiers to occupy the country. Geographically, Iraq was nearly one-fourth the size of Iran and had less than a third of Iran's modern population. If you simply adjust the numbers of troops required for Iraq to Iran's current size and population, you would likely need an invasion force of more than 1 million soldiers and an occupation force of at least 560,000 soldiers, comparable to the peak size of US forces in Vietnam in 1968. To launch a ground campaign aimed at regime change in Iran, Trump would have to commit America to a Vietnam-level conflict that would inevitably lead to a return of the draft. That is almost certainly off the table. What is almost certainly being put on the table, however, are more limited ground campaigns. Actually removing Iran's ability to threaten Hormuz will be a daunting military challenge that will fall just short of a full-scale invasion. Iran's coastline across the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman is long, rugged, and stretches for more than 2,400 kilometers. It is full of caves, bunkers, tunnels, and coves that house Iranian military assets. Fully eliminating them will require an on-the-ground presence. Iran controls multiple smaller islands within and around the strait that enable it to sustain its pressure. And Iran doesn't even need to control its own coastline to continue applying that pressure. It just needs to keep up the atmosphere of fear. They could just keep firing any of their thousands of drones into the strait from hundreds of kilometers away, deep within their interior. Therefore, Trump may commit to lesser operations first. One option on the table is to try and capture Iran's supply of highly enriched uranium. If successful, this would give Trump the ability to claim some kind of a victory by eliminating Iran's ability to develop a nuclear weapon. But even this would be incredibly challenging. The uranium is stored in tunnels deep below a research site in Isfahan, hundreds of kilometers inside Iran. The US would have to send a special forces raid deep into hostile territory, with no element of surprise. And even if it was successful, it would do nothing to stop Iran's ability to just keep blocking Hormuz. It wouldn't end the war. The more discussed option is for the Americans to try and seize Karg Island, a small island that handles more than 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. Seizing it is well within the capability of the US military. Trump would want to seize it to use as a bargaining chip, but the battle for Karg Island will not be a clean surgical operation. Casualties are possible, even likely. The island is within range of Iranian artillery and drones. The operation has a high chance of wrecking the island's oil infrastructure, which Trump has so far resisted attacking precisely out of the fear that damaging it will cause global oil prices to spiral even further out of control. Taking the island would remove Iran's oil from the market, making the price of oil even worse and exacerbating Trump's original dilemma. Even worse, taking the island would do absolutely nothing to stop Iran from still blocking the Strait of Hormuz. The same logic of attritional warfare would exist. Iran's leaders would likely still reason that they could outlast the Americans by keeping the strait closed, triggering a recession in the West leading into the US midterm elections. The other operation that might actually be required is a large combined arms operation within the strait itself. For weeks, the US military has been heavily bombarding this coastline, but permanently ending the threat will require boots on the ground. One option is the seizure of critical islands in the strait, like Abu Musa and the two Tunbul Islands. These islands are controlled by Iran, but their sovereignty is disputed with the UAE. The US could launch amphibious operations under the banner of liberating them. This could enable the deployment of short-range air defenses to help protect tanker traffic. But if that still doesn't crack the strait open, there are further, more dangerous options, like seizing Iran's much larger Qushm Island, or even attempting to take control over sections of the southern coast of Iran itself, all of which will be massively escalatory, massively costly in terms of both resources and blood, and still probably wouldn't actually prevent Iran from just keeping the strait bombarded with their drones from deeper in the interior. The US has talked about using its navy to escort tankers through the strait, but even that is a lot more difficult than it seems. Convoys would need drones, helicopters, fighters, and airborne warning aircraft. Each pair of tankers would likely require one destroyer to escort them, with only 8 destroyers available for escort missions in the theater. Redeploying more will take weeks and continue to sap American military power from the Pacific. Escort missions will be expensive, use up scarce interceptors, and would be an open-ended mission with no clear end in sight. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the US Navy escorted tankers for 14 months and used more than 30 warships at a time to do so. Whether Trump has the patience for an operation of that length and scope is anyone's guess, and that's assuming tanker captains and insurance companies would still be willing to transit through what would remain a terrifying gauntlet. Now that the war has lasted longer than a month, long enough for the Iranians to survive and shut down the Strait of Hormuz, Trump's initial gamble has failed utterly. America is now left with no good options remaining. The war has expanded beyond America's control. Even if they wanted to simply walk away and cut their losses, Iran could just continue keeping the strait closed, holding the global economy hostage until they get the concessions they demand. Walking away is not an option. This means the only 2 choices left are conceding to Iran's demands or escalating the war with boots on the ground to try and force Hormuz open. Neither is an attractive choice. Both will be deeply unpopular decisions. There is no good path forward in what was meant to be a quick, decisive war that has devolved into a grinding, attritional nightmare, just like what Russia has faced in Ukraine for years. This is why this war against Iran is quickly and tragically turning into America's Ukraine. This is the anatomy of a self-inflicted catastrophe, a monumental mess with no easy way out.